In the westerns that shaped the imagination of the West, the cowboy appears as the symbol of courage and justice, while native peoples are reduced to antagonists. But history tells a different story. In many indigenous nations, women held positions of influence. They negotiated, hunted, farmed, made collective decisions, and were heard by councils that recognized their knowledge. This recognition stands in sharp contrast to Europe of the same era, where laws and customs confined women's lives to silence and obedience. As we look more closely at these cultures, Hollywood's simplistic image falls apart. We see complex kinship networks, rituals that organized communal life, and a division of responsibilities that valued everyone's contribution. Understanding this difference doesn't romanticize the past. It broadens our view of the pressures that have spanned centuries and still persist today. By revisiting these histories, we gain tools to recognize present-day inequalities, and above all, to listen to those who keep their languages, memories, and rights alive. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson closely observed the Iroquois Confederacy and saw in it a kind of political engineering that helped shape American democracy. In that system, women weren't just bystanders. They led rituals, influenced decisions, and held key roles in community life, while many men focused on specific social duties. Their power showed up clearly in the Women's Council, which had the authority to choose chiefs and remove them if they failed. This system of shared responsibility helped maintain balance among the tribes. There were also customs that revealed another kind of authority. Among the Kaga, young men were tested by spending a night with an older woman. If she was satisfied, the young man's passage was approved. If not, he had to be reassessed. In several communities, it was women who initiated marital relationships, a gesture that upended expectations and redefined who held the power to shape social bonds. In that tribe, when women's attention became too much, some men would disappear into the forest and hide in shelters they had prepared. If there were several of them, search groups quickly formed. The women tracked footprints, surrounded the trails, and brought the runaways back so they could take responsibility for their duties. That everyday movement stood in contrast to the other extreme: war. In conflicts between peoples and during the westward conquest, it wasn't just men who fought. Omaha, Cheyenne, Ponca, Sioux, and women from other nations took an active part, handling weapons, riding, and organizing ambushes. Accounts of clashes between Texas Rangers and Comanches record that there was no distinction on the battlefield. Anyone who attacked was fired upon. Some stories describe the women warriors as opponents who never surrendered and kept fighting to the very last breath. From those memories comes the figure of a Cheyenne woman nicknamed 10 Without Nails, linked to the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. Tradition says she was the one who brought down George Custer, the commander in that fight, an act that became a symbol of a rare native victory and a reminder that women's leadership didn't appear out of nowhere. It runs through trails, campfires, and battlefields. Captain Robert Custer, a veteran of the campaigns against the Comanches in the 1870s, wrote in a letter about a Native American warrior woman who skillfully handled both a bow and a revolver. More than just an episode, this account opens a window into societies where women fought and took risks, challenging those who wished to confine them to domestic life. These stories go hand in hand with unique family arrangements. Monogamy was common, but polygamy also existed and followed specific rules. Among them was the possibility for a man to ask his first wife's sister to become his second wife, even without her consent, a practice supported by tradition and tribal consensus. Legends reinforce this. It is said that two sisters once lived alone until a man descended from the sky and taught them farming and cooking, an interpretation that justified each husband having two wives. In addition, collective mechanisms managed the shortage of men and regulated births, intertwining survival, belief, and power. In the past, in some Native American tribes, women could enter temporary unions. The idea was to prevent them from being without a partner or descendants, something valued by the group. Looking at marriage in these communities, you can see a kind of pragmatism that connects with modern habits. Young couples would start living together, and if the relationship didn't work out, they would end it. Interestingly, Such flexibility would only become common in the Western world with civil marriage in the second half of the 20th century. Among many indigenous peoples of the Americas, women's prestige guided alliances and decisions. Colonizers noticed and took advantage of this. They kidnapped women to force truces and extract agreements. In the domestic sphere, women's authority was clear. A marriage could end without any court involved. When a man found his belongings outside, he knew it was over and went back to his mother's house. In many traditions, he spent the first few years living with his mother-in-law, learning the customs of the group and taking on responsibilities, including staying close during pregnancy and ensuring a safe birth. There was also an expected rhythm between births, roughly 4 years. When the gap grew too long, questions and pressure followed, usually from other women. These norms, far from the European standard, helped break down one of the Old West's biggest myths, the supposed savagery of native peoples. Sources from the time show the opposite. Many colonizers had poor hygiene while labeling those they saw as different. Understanding this reversal sheds light on the conflict and its strategies of domination. It's interesting to see how what we call hygiene has changed over time. In the early centuries of colonization, many pilgrims didn't associate water with body care. Cleanliness for them mostly meant spotless clothes. If someone dressed well, they were considered clean, no matter how they smelled. The odors of stables and horses seemed normal. Lice and fleas moved around without causing surprise. Around 1620, the idea of purity took on a religious meaning. Certain devotions glorified earthly suffering, and avoiding baths, even when it caused sores, could be seen as a sign of faith. Meanwhile, indigenous peoples bathed naturally in rivers and lakes, combining cleanliness with rituals of renewal. To European eyes, however, that habit was seen as a mark of savagery, not from neglect, but from cultural difference. The settlers, shaped by strict traditions and moral codes, viewed bathing as indecent. The irony of history is that centuries later, Europe would once again value river bathing and more frequent hygiene practices, showing how beliefs and context shape what we call being clean. On Western movie screens, the old practice of cleansing has taken on a heroic glow, a sign of how perspectives shift over time. Behind that filter lies a broader story, the resilience of indigenous women. Under attack and pressure, they kept caring for their bodies and preserving rituals, maintaining respect for themselves and their ancestors. Records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show men and women wearing elaborately crafted clothes with fringes, embroidery, and beads. Earrings, necklaces, and bracelets completed the look, not as mere decoration, but as a language of origin, kinship, and territory. This visual grammar carried through the decades and now inspires runways, fashion editorials, and studios. In daily life, they also embrace their own adornments and self-care. Piercings, rings, chokers, plant oils, homemade dyes, and herbal shampoos. It's no coincidence that many of these formulas found their way into modern cosmetics. Still, the picture wasn't all progress. Customs and prejudice left their marks, like the rule that deemed menstruation impure and forced women to stay away from men, especially during meals, limiting their presence in communal moments. Huisaca, a Native American, once assaulted his own grandmother before a meal and pushed her away from the common fire. He said her impurity would bring the wrath of the gods and put everyone at risk. The episode reveals the social order that surrounded women in different tribes. In sedentary communities, they received more care and lived between the home and the fields. In nomadic groups, however, even though they could have a say in choosing leaders, they were treated as possessions. They carried out the daily work, raised the children, and served their husbands. The older women weighed heavily in the calculation of survival. Seen as a burden, they received less food and had less access to pleasure. Paradoxically, even with an interest in increasing the population, there were practices to limit births, trying to balance resources and movement. Between belief, necessity, and power, women's lives followed rules that protected some and sacrificed others. In many indigenous societies, birth control was part of collective care. Herbs, knowledge, and rituals helped regulate fertility, especially during times of famine, when every new mouth added weight to the village. With colonization, the lives of women in sedentary groups took a different path. Faced with chiefs and soldiers, some men saw an opportunity for gain and began trading women's bodies, silencing their will and affection. That contact created an ambiguous practice, renting out women to colonizers as a political gesture, much like a peace pipe. Children with white fathers could mean alliances and protection. Among peoples like the Cree, girls were destined for these arrangements, which, while sealing pacts, ignored individual desires. In some cases, such encounters turned into marriage. The paradox remained. Private relationships served diplomacy, at the cost of silencing those who had the least choice. For a long time, the idea circulated that agreements with indigenous peoples would only move forward with the active presence of women. Over the years, some male leaders, tired of internal disputes and models they saw as unproductive, began viewing external commitments as a shortcut to ease their responsibilities. Today, in the United States, the group that once included more than 2,200 tribes now numbers around 550, mostly on reservations in the West. There are groups in the North and the Midwest, while the East Coast has few. Among the largest are the Cherokee, with over 300,000 members, and the Navajo, with around 220,000. The Sioux and Chippewa also stand out, both just over 100,000. Not all, however, have federal recognition. In recent years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has received more than 150 requests, but few have been approved. That validation is crucial. It grants sovereign nation status and, with it, the ability to manage land, enact their own laws, and establish taxes. The path to that point remains slow and bureaucratic, demanding persistence and community cohesion to sustain self-determination. On the reservations, even those that maintain sovereignty, daily life remains hard. Unemployment affects many families, and infrastructure often fails. There's no stable electricity, access to education is limited, and food is expensive because the low soil fertility restricts local production. This situation takes a toll on health, with rising diabetes, obesity, and preventable deaths. Faced with that, many young people see two paths: moving to the cities in search of work or joining the gaming industry, which is now important for several tribes because federal taxes don't apply to casinos on indigenous land. Some still dedicate themselves to crafts and keep ancestral practices alive. However, the dominant trend is one of distancing. Most build their lives elsewhere and return only for visits. Each departure weakens kinship networks and the passing down of culture, deepening the feeling of loss. Tackling the problem requires public policies, job opportunities, and respect for the autonomy of indigenous peoples.